Hello and welcome back to Hyperplay RPG. Today we've got for you 5 amazing SNES RPG ROM hacks, the kind of adventures we could have only dreamed of in the 90s. When we were enviously eyeing up in the pages of UK mag Superplay the seemingly endless stream of outstanding JRPGs being released on the Super Famicom over in the land of the rising sun. It just seems so cruel that in the West we are being denied such quality Squaresoft RPGs as the one circled there, Rudra no Hiho, otherwise known as Treasure of the Rudras. But thanks to the glories of emulation and the fan translation community, we can now play Treasure of the Rudras, Rudra no Hiho, in English. And what a pleasure it is, sporting undeniably some of the finest 16-bit visuals you will ever see. Treasure of the Rudras sees you take on 3 separate adventures as you battle to save the world within 16 days. Treasure of the Rudras is a turn-based RPG, much like Final Fantasy VI, albeit that this one was made by Squaresoft's B team. That said, Treasures of the Rudras has an incredibly innovative feature for its time, whereby you could input your own spells and experiment to come up with all sorts of magical combinations, and it sounds tricky, but once you get the hang of it, it's a whole lot of fun, and you can actually break the game, and we're all for breaking a very long multi-hour RPG if it makes it just a little bit easier to get on with the adventure. Now, Treasures of the Rudras isn't perfect, that's why it's at number 5 on our list. The end game does suffer a bit from repetitive dungeonitis, as so many examples of the genre do, but it is definitely worth a playthrough if you long for the glory days of 16-bit RPGs. And you can get some gloriously boxed copies of Treasure of the Rudras with a manual and a map and all sorts of goodies from various reproduction sites. Our very first video actually on YouTube was about unboxing just such an example. So that's the first of our 5 ROM hacks on this list, and that is a straight-up translation, and it's a brilliant translation done to a professional standard. Now, I should say that going forwards in this list, none of these ROM hacks will have a difficulty level increased from the original version of the game. They will be what you call vanilla, because too often we've come across ROM hacks which look great on the surface and we like many of the ideas, but you get into the game and it's punishingly hard and you hit a roadblock. So, yeah, these ROM hacks will be just as easy to play as the original games, but will have a certain extra to them. In the case of Rudra no Hiho, Treasures of the Rudras, it is the English translation. Our next amazing ROM hack, however, isn't a pure translation, it is an improvement hack, and it's an improvement hack for Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals, an RPG that came out in 1996 for the Super Nintendo, in PAL regions and also in Japan. So no translations required. However, there were a bunch of issues with the original release of the game, including a bunch of bugs, and yes, the translation wasn't perfect, but the team behind Frue Lufia, Frue Lufia, have created a superb improvement patch for the original Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals. And Frue Lufia is considered the most complete version of Lufia 2 that now exists. Again, the difficulty is absolutely standard. It has not been made harder. If you want a harder version of Lufia 2, you can check out the Specchio Lufia 2 ROM hack. But what we have here in Frue Lufia is the true version of Lufia 2, a tightening up and making the game much more playable than before, with some excellent rebalancing and some ironing out of plot inconsistencies. As for the game itself, well, Lufia 2 is a real looker, and that's not changed at all in the Frue Lufia patch. It's also got Zelda-esque elements whereby you can use various items like hook shots and arrows and so on. Plenty of puzzles in the dungeons, and the dungeons do go on for some time. So if you like lengthy dungeons with puzzle, then this is the perfect combination of a Final Fantasy VI style game, but with Zelda puzzle elements too. Do bear in mind that Lufia 2 isn't for everyone, however, some of the puzzles can be rather infuriating, and you might get bored of pushing blocks onto switches. Also, the battles are numerous, so you might want to play it on an emulator and be able to have the fast forward toggle ready to hand or finger. You don't have to have played Lufia 1, which is actually a sequel to Lufia 2, as the events in Lufia 2 occur before Lufia 1. However, it would probably help in terms of fleshing out the characters a bit, because there isn't a huge amount of character development in the game, and the story is fairly standard in terms of battling against your evils to stop the end of the world kind of thing. Although there is a bit of a twist at the end, especially if you haven't played the first game, so up to you. Personally, we didn't play the first game, and that was absolutely fine, although we did spoiler ourselves about the conclusion of Lufia 2 and the way it ties in with Lufia 1. But we would advise you to, perfectly fine to go in blind. And as we said, the dungeons are huge. Like this tower, you might get to the top and think that you've done everything, and then you get in and you go to the final door and you think, at last I've made it. You sort yourself out, make sure you're all equipped for the final battle, you're good to go, and what happens? Yep. So bear in mind that there can be some frustration in this. Don't be afraid to use a guide. An online walkthrough would be absolutely fine. And the other thing that it's got is, you can see on the bottom right of the screen there in the battle, is that you have little monsters you can co-opt along the way, and they will help you in battle, although you don't have much control over them. But that's quite advanced for its time, bearing in mind this was only 1996. The towns, you'll go town, dungeon, town, dungeon. The towns are, fairly bland, to be honest. Sure, they look nice, but there's not a huge amount going on in there. So there we are. Lufia 2, definitely worth playing. Not the upper echelon SNES Super Famicom classic that it's become quite fashionable to say that it is. We wouldn't have it in our top 5 SNES RPGs, certainly. But top 15 perhaps, and worth a play if you like that kind of thing. One other innovation, way ahead of its time in Lufia 2, is the Ancient Cave. And that was a multi-floor, procedurally generated dungeon whereby you have to leave your equipment at the door and you almost start again from scratch and you go through. But it's worthwhile going through the battle after battle, because you do get some fantastic treasures. Again, we would recommend using an emulator and taking advantage of numerous save states for that one, because you don't want to come a cropper when you've gone deep into the dungeon then to find out that you've lost all your progress. Because you've carked it. So if after all that you've got the urge to play Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals, then definitely check out the Fru Lufia patch. It is a big improvement of the original version. And coming in at number 3 of our 5 amazing SNES ROM hacks is Teni Mao Zero. Now, we talked about this in our top 10 RPGs, so let's take it from there. Teni Mao Zero, released on the 22nd of December 1995. This is a phenomenal Super Famicom turn-based RPG. If you're a fan of Final Fantasy VI on the SNES, you'll absolutely love this. Very much in the same ilk, with fantastic turn-based battles, tons of secrets to discover, spells galore as well during the turn-based gameplay. Absolutely brilliant, with some of the very best visuals on the system. Now, this was released very late in the Super Famicom's life cycle and never got an official English release, but miraculously, and I'll explain why it's a miracle in a moment, in 2017 a fan translation was released. And the reason it's a miracle is because this game has a unique selling point. It included the personal live game system, which is effectively a real-time clock. You would say at the start of the game, you would input what the real time was, real time and date and year in the real world, into the game, and this would affect various events inside the game itself, like certain festivals would only crop up on a certain day of the year in real life. Admittedly, this was something of a gimmick, but to somehow manage a translation as well as emulating the real-time clock was absolutely incredible, considering with emulation there's no battery backup. So fair play to the team behind the fan translation, and it's a translation that's absolutely done on a professional level. We actually happen to know the head translator, retro translator Tom, thoroughly nice chap, and he also sent us the files by which we could print out our own manual, map and English box for this stellar game. Now, these English fan-translated physical materials aren't available anywhere, but if you drop us a line to rpgzine@hotmail.com or contact us through our website, hyperplayrpg.com, we can point you in the direction of how to get them. Absolutely beautiful physical materials. I mean, the manual itself is, well, 40, 50 pages packed full of art and fantastic information. And the map is double-sided with the game world, which is ancient Japan. The idea is that it's an ancient Western traveller's impression of Japan. Anyway, back to the game, and Teni Mao Zero sports some of the best, most beautiful eye-popping visuals on the Super Famicom, as well as a wonderful orchestral soundtrack. With tight gameplay and dungeons that don't overstay their welcome, we heartily recommend Teni Mao Zero to anyone who loves old-school turn-based RPGs. Oh, and don't be frightened to use a guide near the end to make sure you pick up all the spells from the old hermits hiding in their caves. Like this excellent walkthrough on Neoseeker. Yep, very good stuff. Teni Mao Zero, probably the greatest SNES RPG you've never played, and we highly recommend it. One you may well have played already is Final Fantasy V, but here we're going to be talking about the GBA translation patch that can be applied to the Super Famicom Final Fantasy V ROM. Now this again made our top 10 RPGs, so you can have a little listen at what we said about it there if you like. Officially, Final Fantasy V has since been released for the GBA, and that is the best version in terms of the script. I actually played a SNES version with the GBA script patched in, and it was absolutely perfect, and the sprite work looked much better than I thought it would, and maybe that's because there was some extra touching up, and we used romhacking.net to get the patch for the GBA script. Sadly, romhacking.net might be going the way of the dodo these days, but that's another story. Regardless, however you play Final Fantasy V in English, it is definitely worthwhile, and once again, a majestic job system is at the heart of this one. Now, the Final Fantasy battle systems, up until the more recent iterations at least, were the work of one Hiroyuki Ito, an incredibly talented programmer at Square who's been there since the original Final Fantasy, and it's thanks to him that we had the active time battle system that came in with Final Fantasy IV, the job system in Final Fantasy V. He sorted out the Espers and some character development in Final Fantasy VI, and he was also involved with Final Fantasy VIII's junction system, very much at the head of it, although he then went on to work on Final Fantasy IX, and someone else came in and implemented the controversial draw system in Final Fantasy VIII. Anyway, that's Hiroyuki Ito at Square, an absolute genius. But there's much more to Final Fantasy V than a job system that was way ahead of its time. Yes, that is the principal draw and makes the game incredibly fun to play from a gameplay point of view. But the story, whilst largely derided as rote or pretty standard for JRPG fare, is actually very humorous. Another game that's quite funny that's on this list. And certainly the GBA script brings out that humour to the max. There are some great characters in Final Fantasy V too. Pink-haired Faris, who you can see there, is a character way ahead of their time. Thoroughly enjoyed Faris's character arc. Once again, Nobuo Uematsu's soundtrack is absolutely brilliant. Hugely evocative and atmospheric as always. Final Fantasy V is much better than Final Fantasy IV. On the face of it, Final Fantasy IV's story is more interesting, but it's so melodramatic and over the top, with characters sacrificing themselves willy-nilly left, right and centre, that actually there's a much greater sense of believability to Final Fantasy V, and overall it's just a vast improvement on Final Fantasy IV. In Final Fantasy V, sacrifice is hard thought, and not a throwaway gesture, like in Final Fantasy IV. The music, while not having the breadth of Final Fantasy VI or maybe even Final Fantasy IV, has some big-ticket tunes that are upper echelon Uematsu and add some extra emotional oomph to the important scenes. There's secrets and treasure to be found at every turn, if you can find them, and the layered world maps, allowing exploration above and below ground, are an absolute marvel for 1992. And as with all good JRPGs, there's many a battle, but there's never a grind, and customization is the key here. The palettes, textures and sprites are all excellent here, and it's quite obvious that this isn't the first time that this particular developer has delved deep into the hardware to get the best out of it. And the boss battles are a puzzle in themselves as you try and fathom which particular jobs and combinations are best suited to get the better of the big bads. Of course, it's not all perfect. Stat buffs and boosts from items are never actually laid out in the game, so you don't know exactly what they do. It's a matter of trial and error, and that's never a good idea for an RPG. So sorry to all you Final Fantasy IV fans there for that bit of Final Fantasy IV bashing, but we just wanted to say that we believe Final Fantasy V is one of the best RPGs ever, and the GBA patch for the Super Famicom version is the way to go for those seeking the finest version of Final Fantasy V. And so we come to it at last, top spot on our 5 amazing SNES RPG ROM hacks, and you might be able to guess what the base game for this number 1 is. Indeed, it's Final Fantasy VI. And recently released is Antinomia Final Fantasy VI. Now, there are many Final Fantasy VI ROM hacks that have done the rounds, but this is the one we recommend above all others. And what it does is it brings in General Leo and really augments his story so that he is as much a protagonist for the first half of the game as Terra or any of the other Final Fantasy VI crew. And then, don't want to spoil anything, but when you get into the world of Ruin, General Leo is going to be there too. He survives this in this particular version, and you get extra scenes that really help flesh out Cerez's backstory and also augments and improves your understanding of what Terra is going through as well. So absolutely brilliant to be able to see this extra footage of General Leo as if it had come from a director's cut of Final Fantasy VI is superb, and the sprite work is on point. It perfectly matches up with the Amano artwork that you've seen earlier on our title screen. And these extra scenes and dialogue really could have been written by Squaresoft back in the day. They do fit in absolutely perfectly, and this is absolutely, we would now say, the finest way to play our all-time favourite RPG. There have been many other hacks of Final Fantasy VI, such as an uncensored original Ted Woolsey translation, which is good, but doesn't add much to the game. There's also Brave New World, which again purports not to be more difficult, but actually does spike the difficulty a bit. There's Final Fantasy VI Return of the Dark Sorcerer, which has lots of fun additions but goes too far in our opinion, including Professor Oak from Pokemon and even Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, which we can't get on board with. Then there's the hack called Final Fantasy VI Tea Edition, Tea for Tomato, which is very popular in Japan and adds extra dungeons and side stories and so on, but is crushingly difficult. I mean, we could not get past the Phantom Train scenario, no matter what we tried, and we have played Final Fantasy VI many times. It was not our first rodeo, not our first Final Fantasy VI rodeo. And then this isn't even the first General Leo focused Final Fantasy VI ROM hack. There's also Final Fantasy VI Divergent Paths, which is also fascinating and purports to maintain the vanilla experience while also adding a bit of extra General Leo content. However, again, even though they say that it's a vanilla difficulty, it's not, because they've made changes such as making Edgar's weapons breakable and other weapons as well, which, to be honest, we couldn't really abide in Breath of the Wild, and we can less abide it in Final Fantasy VI. So if you want extra content, extra General Leo content with your Final Fantasy VI, then Antinomia Final Fantasy VI is 100% the way to go. You won't regret it. And that's it, 5 amazing SNES ROM hacks, all worth your time. Thank you very much indeed for tuning in. We hope you found something that has piqued your interest. If you have, then you know what to do. A like would be a high potion, a subscription would be an elixir. And also please do comment in, well, the comments below, if you found any ROM hacks yourself that aren't on this list that you think are absolute must-plays, whether it's on the SNES or otherwise. Thanks again for watching. Take care, all the best, and happy RPGing. Bye-bye.